He forced his own daughter to sing while a blade sliced her brain apart, then locked her in a hidden asylum for 60 years just to clear his son's path to power. He bankrolled mob killers and appeased fascists, yet America worships his bloodline as royalty. This is Joseph Kennedy and the most sickening sins of old money exposed. How exactly did a sociopath buy the White House? He treated every human interaction as a transactional power play. He ruled through extortion and financial blackmail, wielding a political worldview that nearly derailed the Allied war effort, and ultimately pushed his own bloodline into a devastating generational cycle of tragedy. This empire of ambition stemmed entirely from a festering psychological wound. Every ruthless business deal, every political betrayal, and every cruel domestic decree Joseph Kennedy enacted stemmed from a singular fatal weakness, a desperate, unquenchable need for validation from a ruling class that fundamentally despised him. Born in 1888 in East Boston, Joseph bypassed the slums. While Kennedy mythology often paints a picture of destitute famine ships, his father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, was already a highly prosperous businessman. Patrick owned multiple saloons, a wholesale liquor import business, and most importantly, he was a powerful ward boss in local Democratic politics. He controlled the votes of his neighborhood, which meant he controlled the politicians. The Kennedys had significant wealth, and they had raw street-level influence. But in the rigidly stratified, deeply prejudiced society of turn-of-the-century Boston, they were still just Irish Catholics. At that time, the city was entirely controlled by the Boston Brahmins. These were the wealthy Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites who traced their lineage back to the Mayflower, living in fortified social isolation in the mansions of Beacon Hill. The Brahmins controlled the major banks, the shipping lines, the universities, and the courts. It is a sharp historical irony that many of these Brahmin families had built their initial fortunes on the illegal opium trade in China or on the backs of slave-picked cotton in the South, yet they looked down upon the newly wealthy Irish as crude, corrupt, and racially inferior. To the Brahmins, the Irish were an underclass fit for manual labor, serving drinks and running saloon politics, but permanently barred from the drawing rooms of high society. Joseph Kennedy was determined to cross that invisible, ironclad border. He refused to be defined by his neighborhood. He attended the Boston Latin School, a highly prestigious public institution that served as a feeder for the Ivy League. Here, he bypassed bookish scholarship, operating instead as an aggressively charismatic networker. He was intensely focused on his physical presentation, wearing immaculate suits and commanding attention in every room. He was paving his way to Harvard College, the ultimate, heavily guarded proving ground of the American elite. When he arrived at Harvard in 1908, he fully expected his father's bank account, his athletic prowess, and his relentless charm to buy his entry into the inner sanctum of the ruling class. He lived in the most expensive dormitories on the so-called Gold Coast of the campus. He dressed impeccably. He even actively distanced himself from other Irish Catholic students, preferring to lend money to wealthy Protestant classmates who were temporarily short on cash, carefully and quietly accumulating social debts. He was playing their game on their turf, attempting to buy their respect. But the Brahmin establishment had a built-in mechanism for keeping their bloodlines and their boardrooms pure, the final clubs. The most prestigious and exclusive of these societies was the Porcellian Club. Membership in the Porcellian was not merely a college social distinction. It was a lifelong, unbreakable guarantee of access to the absolute highest echelons of American finance, law, and political power. If you were in the Porcellian, you were untouchable. Kennedy campaigned for entry with the same ruthless, calculating efficiency he would later use in presidential elections. He called in favors. He leveraged his wealth. He showcased his value. But when the time came for the final selection, the doors of the Porcellian Club, and indeed every other top-tier final club on campus, remained firmly and violently shut to him. They blackballed him without a second thought. The rejection was absolute, silent, and entirely unforgiving. They would happily take his money at the underground poker tables. They would drink his father's liquor, but they would never, under any circumstances, call an Irish Catholic their equal. The rejection permanently hardened him. His jaw set. The easy collegiate smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, calculating glare. The sting of being treated as a second-class citizen despite his immense wealth fractured his pride and fundamentally broke his moral compass. He realized in that precise moment that playing by their rules was a fool's errand. If the American aristocracy would not invite him into the room, he would have to accumulate enough terrifying power to simply buy the entire building and evict them all. He resolved to create his own dynasty, an empire so vast and powerful that it would force the Brahmins to bow to his children. He did not just brood over this social slight, he weaponized his anger. Upon graduating in 1912, he immediately sought to dominate the very financial systems that had just excluded him. Bypassing the bottom rungs of a brokerage firm, he immediately secured a political appointment as a Massachusetts state bank examiner. He absolutely did not take this grueling job for its meager civil service salary. He took it for the unparalleled, legally protected intelligence it provided. As a state bank examiner, Kennedy had unfettered access to the internal ledgers, the hidden debts, the toxic assets, and the vulnerable margins of very single major bank in Massachusetts. He spent thousands of hours in poorly lit vaults, meticulously copying down the financial secrets of the very Protestant elite who had shunned him at Harvard. This was legal, state-sponsored corporate espionage. He discovered a thrilling, dangerous secret. Many of the elite Brahmin families living in massive mansions on Beacon Hill were actually swimming in debt, holding heavily leveraged assets, and teetering on the edge of insolvency. Their superiority was an illusion maintained by credit. Kennedy was quietly building a massive, devastating dossier of leverage, understanding early on that true power comes from knowing exactly where your enemies are financially bleeding. And that very habit of viewing every social slight as a mandate for total, annihilating retaliation and using insider information to crush opponents will come back to ruin him later. His first opportunity to unleash this gathered intelligence came when his father's small neighborhood bank, the Columbia Trust Company, was suddenly threatened with a hostile takeover by a much larger Brahmin-controlled financial institution. Joseph saw his first real battlefield. He was only 25 years old, but he moved with the predatory instinct of a seasoned Wall Street raider. Rather than merely defending the bank, he launched a ruthless, high-speed counteroffensive. Operating on practically no sleep, he frantically borrowed massive sums of money from family, friends, and anyone he had leveraged over the years, buying up proxy shares with ferocious speed before the larger bank even knew what was happening. He outmaneuvered the older, established, arrogant bankers, blocked their takeover entirely, and had himself elected president of Columbia Trust. The local press immediately dubbed him the youngest bank president in America. It was his first major public victory against the establishment. and it cemented his lifelong operational template. Find the enemy's weakness, ruthlessly exploit the margins of the rules, and take the prize by absolute financial force. By the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, Kennedy looked at the balance sheets of his small bank and realized a grim truth. The avenues for acquiring the kind of world-altering wealth he craved through legal, standard banking were entirely too slow. He was a man in a desperate hurry to conquer a country that didn't want him. To force the world to respect him, he needed a fortune that completely eclipsed ordinary wealth. He needed the kind of unregulated, massive cash flow that could bend the law and purchase political influence wholesale. He looked past the genteel, regulated boardrooms of Boston and fixed his terrifying gaze on the unregulated shadows. He prepared to build the financial bedrock of his multi-billion-dollar empire through alliances and methods that the civilized world would find utterly abhorrent. And as the government passed the Volstead Act outlawing the sale of alcohol across the United States, Joseph Kennedy saw not a moral crusade, but the greatest illicit business opportunity in the history of the world. On January 17, 1920, the United States government committed a spectacular act of economic self-mutilation. The Volstead Act went into effect, officially banning the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors across the nation. For moral crusaders, prohibition was a triumph of religious purity. For the working class, it was the abrupt end of their social sanctuaries. But for Joseph Patrick Kennedy, sitting in his immaculate Boston office, the 18th Amendment was not a legal restriction. It was the ringing of a golden bell. He did not see a ban. He saw a state-sponsored monopoly on an inelastic, high-demand commodity. The public narrative surrounding the Kennedy fortune often glosses over this era, preferring to focus on his later years as an ambassador and a statesman. Yet the architecture of his empire rested entirely on a subterranean foundation. While official records remain elusive, persistent historical rumors and underworld testimonies suggest the Kennedy dynasty was heavily supercharged by black market capital. To buy the respect of the American elite, many historians believe Joseph Kennedy first became one of the most sophisticated white-collar bootleggers in the country. This lingering resentment overrode any conventional morality. He viewed the law not as a sacred boundary, but as a minor logistical hurdle designed by hypocrites. He knew a profound unspoken truth about the Boston Brahmins and the Wall Street tycoons. They publicly championed prohibition to control the immigrant working class, but privately, they still desperately wanted their imported scotch. Kennedy decided he would be the man to pour their drinks at an exorbitant, illegal markup, and he would use their own money to eventually buy them out. Kennedy possessed an unparalleled advantage in this newly minted criminal enterprise. Rather than a street thug firing a Tommy gun from the running boards of a Ford Model 18, he operated as a calculated banker. Furthermore, his father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, had been a highly successful wholesale liquor importer before the ban. Joseph already knew the transatlantic supply chains. He knew the British and Scottish distillery owners. He understood maritime shipping routes, import tariffs, and distribution logistics. When Prohibition hit, the only operational difference was that the government tariffs were replaced by police bribes, and the distribution fleets had to be armed. He immediately leveraged these old-world connections. While amateur bootleggers were poisoning people in backwoods stills with toxic bathtub gin, Kennedy dealt strictly in premium, imported stock. He reportedly secured exclusive clandestine contracts with massive British distillers, including the distributors for Dewar's and Gordon's gin, but importing millions of dollars of contraband across the Atlantic required a terrifyingly complex operation. This was the era of Rum Row, a maritime phenomenon where armadas of supply ships from Europe and Canada would anchor just 3 miles off the American coast, sitting strictly in international waters where the Coast Guard had no jurisdiction. Kennedy functioned as a supreme financier of this shadow economy. He bankrolled the fleets of small, high-powered speedboats that would race out to Rum Row under the cover of darkness, load up with wooden crates of premium liquor, and sprint back to the hidden coves and jagged coastlines of New England. This operation required massive liquidity, which Kennedy had safely washed through his legitimate banking fronts, and it required absolute iron-fisted enforcement, which he entirely outsourced. This is the most crucial aspect of how Joseph Kennedy exercised power: the total sociopathic compartmentalization of violence. He constructed a fortress of plausible deniability. The public saw a devoted conservative Catholic husband and father. They saw a man who attended Sunday Mass with his beautiful wife Rose and his growing brood of perfectly dressed children. They saw a respectable bank president and a real estate investor. But beneath this pristine, deeply cultivated veneer, he was negotiating in smoke-filled rooms with the most dangerous men in America. To move massive quantities of liquor from the coastlines of Massachusetts into the highly lucrative, insatiable markets of New York City and Chicago, a Boston banker could not operate alone. He had to cross borders controlled by the syndicate. He had to form alliances with the architects of organized crime. Persistent historical rumors and later testimonies from the underworld frequently linked Kennedy to direct business relationships with titans of the underworld, most notably Frank Costello, famously known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and Meyer Lansky, the brilliant mathematical genius who served as the mob's accountant. The Dine. Mike in these meetings was a masterpiece of tension. Kennedy, the arrogant, Harvard-educated Irishman in a bespoke suit, sitting across from hardened immigrant killers who controlled armies of street soldiers. Kennedy brought something to the table that the mob desperately needed: clean, white-collar infrastructure. He provided the initial capital without leaving a paper trail. He used his father's old political machine to ensure local judges, dock inspectors, and police captains looked the other way when the speedboats landed. And, most brazenly, he exploited legal loopholes that the gangsters could not access. The most astonishing example of this was the medicinal alcohol loophole. Under the Volstead Act, alcohol could still be legally prescribed by doctors for medicinal purposes. Kennedy, utilizing his legitimate corporate fronts, quietly purchased the franchise rights to a chain of pharmacies or leveraged medical supply licenses. Through these perfectly legal government-stamped permits, he imported thousands of cases of pure, hard liquor in broad daylight. Once the shipments cleared customs under the protection of the law, the inventory miraculously disappeared from the warehouses, redirected straight into the underground speakeasies controlled by Costello and Lansky. He was essentially using the federal government to subsidize a criminal enterprise. It was an act of breathtaking audacity, highlighting the massive gap between his public image as a law-abiding citizen and his private reality as an underworld facilitator. However, swimming with sharks inevitably draws blood. Dealing with the mafia was not a gentleman's game, and Kennedy's fatal flaw, his overwhelming arrogance, almost cost him his life. He operated under the dangerous delusion that he was inherently smarter and socially superior to his criminal partners. He treated men who routinely ordered murders as mere employees. According to testimonies later shared by mob associates, including Costello himself, in his twilight years, there were moments of severe, life-threatening friction. The mobsters viewed Kennedy as a useful, but ultimately expendable suit. When shipments went missing, or when Kennedy attempted to dictate terms too aggressively, the underlying threat of violence was immediate. There are widely circulated historical rumors of a tense standoff where Kennedy, attempting to bypass the New York syndicate to increase his own profit margins, received a direct physical threat from the mob. He quickly realized that his Harvard degree and his bank presidency meant absolutely nothing against a bullet in a dark alley. He was forced to back down, a rare and humiliating concession for a man who demanded total control. While he never personally pulled a trigger or broke a rival's kneecap, many accounts suggest he enthusiastically bankrolled the syndicate men who did. Every dollar he pulled from the illegal liquor trade was soaked in the blood of the gang wars that were tearing American cities apart. Yet, he felt not a single shred of moral responsibility. In his mind, the violence was just a business expense, carried out by people he considered beneath him. His family was safe in their gated compounds. What happened in the slums of Chicago or the docks of New York was entirely irrelevant. As the 1920s roared on, Kennedy amassed a fortune so large it was almost uncountable. Vast reserves of cash hidden entirely off the books. But he was a calculating man, and he possessed a rare, chilling foresight. He knew that prohibition was a temporary political experiment that would eventually collapse under its own violent weight. He also knew that maintaining partnerships with unpredictable, volatile mafia bosses was an unsustainable risk. A single betrayal, a single miscalculation with a man like Meyer Lansky could end his life and destroy the dynasty he was trying to build before it even truly began. He needed an exit strategy. He needed to take the massive, dirty capital he had generated in the shadows and aggressively launder it into the brightest, most respected avenues of the American economy. He needed to wash the money so thoroughly that the Brahmin elite would have no choice but to accept it. He looked away from the dark harbors and the hidden speakeasies, and he fixed his gaze on the booming, frenzied, entirely unregulated stock market of the late 1920s. Sensing the inevitable collapse of prohibition and the fatal risks of dealing with syndicate killers, Kennedy sought a safer, yet equally ruthless playground. He traded the dark, fog-choked harbors of the bootlegging routes for the polished mahogany and gleaming brass of lower Manhattan, realizing he could extract 10 times the wealth in broad daylight without dodging a single bullet. Wall Street in the Roaring '20s was a completely lawless frontier. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission and no rules against insider trading. To Kennedy, the New York Stock Exchange was simply a casino with no floor manager, run by the very Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites who had blackballed him at Harvard. He arrived on Wall Street specifically to hijack the American dream. Bringing with him the massive liquid capital he had accumulated in the shadows, he prepared to unleash a new kind of violence. It was a financial violence that left no physical bodies in the street, but would very soon drive thousands of innocent, hard-working families to absolute ruin. He exercised supreme, invisible power through a mechanism called the stock pool, the 1920s equivalent of a legalized robbery. He systematically rigged the game while convincing the public they had a fair chance to win. Kennedy would gather a small secret syndicate of incredibly wealthy men. They would select a target, usually a mid-tier, unassuming company. Then they would begin to trade massive blocks of this stock back and forth exclusively among themselves. To the outside world, watching the ticker tape, it looked like a sudden, organic explosion of market interest. The stock price would tick upward. Then Kennedy would deploy his psychological weaponry. He understood that human beings are driven by a desperate fear of missing out. He maintained a payroll of corrupt financial journalists and newspaper columnists. He would literally hand them envelopes of cash to plant glowing, entirely fabricated stories about the target company's fictional new contracts or magical upcoming dividends. It was an orchestrated illusion. The working class man in Boston or the school teacher in Ohio would read the morning paper, see the soaring stock price on the ticker, and believe they had found their ticket to the middle class. They would pour their life savings into the stock. This was the pump. As the public rushed in, driving the price to an artificial, dizzying peak, Kennedy stood at the center of the trading floor, his face completely devoid of emotion, watching the numbers climb. Then came the dump. In a synchronized, lightning-fast maneuver, Kennedy and his syndicate would sell off their entire holdings at the absolute top of the market. They instantly liquidated their shares, pocketing millions of dollars in pure profit. The sudden, massive sell-off would trigger a panic. The stock price would instantly collapse, plummeting straight to the bottom. The syndicate vanished into the smoke, their bank accounts overflowing, while the everyday Americans who had bought into the illusion were left holding worthless paper. Their life savings were simply wiped out in an afternoon. Kennedy felt absolutely no remorse for the victims of his manipulation. To him, the people who lost their money were simply fools, collateral damage in his personal war against the establishment. The sheer velocity of his ruthlessness surfaced during the infamous Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, stock pool of 1928. RCA was the tech darling of the decade, the Apple or Tesla of its era. Kennedy was hired to manage a pool to inflate its stock. Over a period of just a few weeks, utilizing his network of paid tipsters and aggressive floor traders, he whipped the market into a complete frenzy. The stock skyrocketed. At the precise moment of maximum public euphoria, Kennedy quietly signaled his syndicate to sell. The pool made a staggering $5 million in pure profit in a matter of days. Kennedy personally walked away with over $1 million, the equivalent of roughly $17 million today, for a few weeks of orchestrating a lie. The physical reality of his life at this moment was a stunning contradiction. Publicly, the newspapers hailed him as a boy wonder of finance, a self-made Irish-American titan with a beautiful growing family. He wore perfectly tailored suits, his hair flawlessly slicked back, projecting an aura of dignified success. But privately, inside his office, the physical manifestation of his psychology was chilling. Observers noted that while other traders screamed, sweat, and panicked on the floor of the exchange, Kennedy sat in absolute terrifying silence. He would let the ticker tape slip smoothly through his long fingers, his eyes cold and unblinking. He was a predator watching a snare pull tight. But his greatest, most devastating triumph was yet to come. By the summer of 1929, the American stock market had reached a state of hysterical, irrational euphoria. Everyone, from factory workers to millionaires, was borrowing money to buy stocks on margin. The nation believed the boom would last forever, but Kennedy was not blinded by optimism. He was a man who looked for the rot beneath the floorboards. According to a legendary story that Kennedy himself loved to tell, the epiphany came while he was getting his shoes shined in the financial district. The young boy shining his shoes looked up and started giving Kennedy stock tips, confidently explaining which shares were about to soar. For Kennedy, this was not a charming interaction. It was a blaring red alert siren. He might realize that if a shoeshine boy, someone with zero financial training and zero capital, was speculating in the market, then there was no one left to buy. There was no more dumb money to pump into the system. The bubble was entirely inflated by the desperate hopes of the lower classes, and it was about to burst with catastrophic force. Bypassing any public warning, he quietly and systematically liquidated his massive multi-million-dollar long positions. He took his fortune out of the market, and then he did something that perfectly encapsulates the depth of his predatory instinct. He didn't just walk away, he turned around and began to aggressively short the market. He placed massive bets that the American economy was going to collapse. He positioned himself to profit from the destruction of the country. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday struck. The market shattered. Panic swept through Wall Street like a contagion. As the days bled into Black Tuesday, the devastation was absolute. Fortunes that had taken generations to build evaporated in minutes. Bankers, the very men who had once looked down on Kennedy, threw themselves from high-rise windows. Thousands of banks failed. Millions of Americans lost their jobs, their homes, and their futures as the Great Depression clamped its jaws around the throat of the nation. Amidst this apocalyptic economic ruin, the contradiction of Joseph Kennedy reached its absolute peak. While millions of Americans stood in bread lines, shivering in threadbare coats, begging for soup, Kennedy retreated to the sun-drenched verandas of his Palm Beach estate. He looked at his private ledgers. Because he had shorted the market, the crash had not ruined him. It had immortalized him. His net worth had skyrocketed. By the early 1930s, his fortune was estimated at roughly $180 million, the equivalent of over $4 billion today. He had done it. He had mathematically beaten the Brahmins. He possessed more liquid capital than the men W.W. had blackballed him from the Porcellian Club could even comprehend. But as he sat in his mansion, looking out over the Atlantic Ocean, a restless, dark ambition began to stir once again. He realized that money, even $4 billion of it, was essentially silent. You could lock it in a vault, but it couldn't speak for you. It couldn't change how the public perceived you. The Anglo-Saxon elite still considered him a vulgar, nouveau riche Irish bootlegger, no matter how many zeros were in his bank account. To truly force the world to respect him, to build the untouchable dynasty he craved, he needed more than just financial dominance. He needed cultural dominance. He needed to control the narrative. He needed to dictate what the American public saw, what they believed, and who they idolized. He looked away from the shattered ruins of Wall Street, and he turned his terrifying focus toward the shimmering, sun-baked hills of California. He arrived in Los Angeles not on a pilgrimage of artistic discovery, but on a highly calculated crusade of corporate conquest. By the mid-1920s, Joseph Patrick Kennedy had realized that the raw accumulation of wealth was insufficient to cure the psychological wound inflicted by the Boston elite. Money could buy mansions, but it could not buy the American imagination. To truly dominate the culture, to force the country to idolize his family and respect his name, he needed to control the machinery of myth-making. He needed Hollywood. Driven by an absolute inability to accept a secondary role, He invaded the film industry with the ruthlessness of a warlord, bypassing normal investments. The Hollywood of this era was a chaotic, rapidly expanding boomtown. It was run by former garment merchants and Nickelodeon operators who had stumbled into a gold mine of silent cinema. They were passionate, erratic, and deeply vulnerable to a man who understood the cold, terrifying mathematics of Wall Street. Kennedy looked at the shimmering studio lots and the glamorous movie stars, and he felt absolutely no romance. Where the public saw art and entertainment, Kennedy saw only distribution bottlenecks, under-leveraged assets, and a chaotic supply chain begging to be monopolized. His presence in California was a jarring contradiction to the sunny, flamboyant culture of the film business. While directors screamed through megaphones in riding boots and actresses paraded in silk, Kennedy stalked the boardrooms in severe, impeccably tailored dark East Coast suits. His face remained a mask of polite, chilling indifference. He was a shark swimming through a coral reef, completely uninterested in the colors, entirely focused on the blood. His entry point was a struggling second-rate studio called the Film Booking Offices of America, or FBO. FBO did not produce prestige dramas. It churned out cheap, low-budget westerns and melodramas. Kennedy bought it for a fraction of its potential value and immediately applied the brutal, unsentimental efficiency of a bank liquidator. He slashed salaries, fired hundreds of employees, and streamlined production to the minute. But his true genius and his true cruelty lay in how he weaponized distribution. He perfected a system known as block booking. He essentially told independent theater owners across the country that if they wanted the rights to show one or two genuinely popular films, they were legally forced to buy a block of 20 or 30 terrible, cheaply made FBO movies. It was financial extortion wrapped in a distribution contract. He shifted all the financial risk onto the small business owners, guaranteeing his own massive profits, regardless of the quality of his product. But the real power in Hollywood did not lie in making cheap westerns. The ultimate leverage belonged to the men who owned the physical theaters. You could produce the greatest film in the world, but if you didn't own the brick-and-mortar palaces where the public bought their tickets, you were still begging for shelf space. Kennedy wanted to own the shelf. This unyielding drive for total domination led him to engineer one of the most spectacular, complex corporate mergers in entertainment history. He recognized earlier than most that the era of silent films was dead and that talkies, movies with synchronized sound, were the future. He approached David Sarnoff, the brilliant head of the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, which held the patents for the most advanced sound technology. Kennedy convinced Sarnoff to merge RCA's technology, Kennedy's FBO studio, and a massive chain of vaudeville theaters into one gigantic monopolistic behemoth, RKO Pictures. With the creation of RKO, Kennedy suddenly controlled the technology, the production, and a vast network of theaters. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. To cement his absolute control over the West Coast theater market, there was one final glittering prize he needed to capture. That prize belonged to a man named Alexander Pantages. Pantages was a legendary figure, a Greek immigrant who had arrived in America penniless, worked in the gold rushes of the Yukon, and slowly, meticulously built an empire with his own bare hands. He was the quintessential self-made man. By the late 1920s, Pantages owned a magnificent, highly lucrative chain of 63 luxurious theater palaces, stretching across the western United States and Canada. They were architectural marvels, dripping in gold leaf and crystal chandeliers. Kennedy approached Pantages with an offer to buy the entire chain for RKO. It was a substantial offer backed by Wall Street capital, but Pantages, fiercely proud of the empire he had built from nothing, flatly refused. He told the cold, calculating Boston banker that his theaters were not for sale. For Joseph Kennedy, hearing the word no was not a negotiation tactic. It was an unforgivable insult. In Kennedy's mind, he was the aristocrat, and Pantages was an immigrant theater operator who needed to be taught a lesson. In absolute power, Kennedy decided that if he could not buy the Pantages empire, he would utterly destroy the man and take it from the ruins. The siege began with financial starvation. Utilizing his vast, newly consolidated power through RKO and his alliances with other major studio heads, Kennedy initiated a devastating boycott. He systematically cut off Alexander Pantages from accessing any first-run high-quality films. He used his Wall Street leverage to ensure that other studios also refused to do business with the Greek theater magnate. Practically overnight, the magnificent Pantages palaces were left with nothing to show but outdated second-rate movies. Audiences evaporated. The massive overhead costs of running 63 luxury theaters began to bleed Pantages dry. It was a classic, ruthless mob tactic, executed flawlessly in the corporate boardroom. But Pantages was a street fighter. Despite the crushing financial pressure, he refused to break. He dug into his own cash reserves, determined to outlast the boycott. He publicly vowed that he would never surrender his life's work to Kennedy's syndicate. Kennedy realized that financial warfare alone might not be enough, or at least it wasn't fast enough. To break a man who has built his own kingdom, you cannot just attack his bank account. You must annihilate his reputation. You must make him socially radioactive. And this is where the story of Joseph Kennedy in Hollywood descends from corporate ruthlessness into a realm of terrifying, engineered malice. On August 9th, 1929, a 17-year-old aspiring dancer named Eunice Pringle burst out of Alexander Pantages' private office in downtown Los Angeles. Her clothes were torn, she was sobbing hysterically, and she immediately claimed to the police that the 62-year-old theater magnate had violently assaulted her during an audition. The ensuing scandal was an atomic bomb dropped directly onto the Pantages empire. The timing of the accusation was so staggeringly perfect for Jose P.H. Kennedy's syndicate that it defied all mathematical probability. The Los Angeles press, heavily influenced by studio money and the sensationalism of the era, descended on Pantages with a vicious, unending fury. The Greek immigrant, once celebrated as a titan of industry, was instantly painted as a depraved, predatory monster. The trial of Alexander Pantages became a national spectacle. The prosecution's case relied entirely on the emotional, highly dramatic testimony of Eunice Pringle. Throughout the proceedings, observers noted a bizarre, unsettling detail. Pringle, a relatively unknown dancer, was suddenly represented by some of the most expensive, high-powered, and politically connected lawyers in California. Furthermore, she appeared in court wearing immaculate, wildly expensive tailored suits that a struggling teenager could never possibly afford. Where was the funding coming from? The press, blinded by the scandal, rarely asked. The psychological and physical toll on Pantages was absolute. The proud, defiant tycoon aged 10 years in a matter of weeks. His face collapsed into a hollow mask of exhaustion and terror. His theaters, already starved of movies, by Kennedy's boycott, now faced massive public boycotts led by moral decency leagues. He was bleeding millions of dollars, facing years in a brutal state penitentiary, and his legacy was completely incinerated, broken, terrified, and desperate to liquidate assets to pay for his staggering legal defense. Pantages finally surrendered. While he was fighting for his life in a courtroom, he sold his magnificent chain of 63 theaters. He did not sell them for their true multi-million-dollar valuation. He sold them under extreme duress, for a fraction of their worth, directly to the associates of RKO, the very syndicate orchestrated by Joseph Kennedy. The coup was complete. Kennedy had acquired one of the greatest theater empires in America for pennies on the dollar. Pantages was initially convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. It was a death sentence. However, the story possesses a dark, revealing epilogue. Pantages hired a new legal team and relentlessly fought the conviction. 2 years later, the California Supreme Court overturned the verdict, citing massive judicial errors and highly prejudiced rulings during the first trial. In his second trial, Pantages was completely acquitted. The jury found the evidence of assault deeply unconvincing, and defense attorneys strongly implied that the entire encounter had been a meticulously staged frame-up. The most chilling piece of the puzzle arrived years later. According to persistent, though still heavily debated Hollywood lore, Eunice Pringle allegedly made a deathbed confession in the 1930s. Some accounts claim she admitted that Alexander Pantages had never touched her, and that she had been paid a massive sum of money by a syndicate of powerful Hollywood executives to stage the attack, rip her own clothes, and destroy the man who refused to sell his theaters. While Joseph Kennedy's name was never officially on the checks handed to Pringle's lawyers, the mechanics of power are rarely signed in ink. He was the sole ultimate beneficiary of the destruction of Alexander Pantages. He had demonstrated a terrifying capacity to orchestrate the total annihilation of a human being simply to acquire real estate. Pantages, though legally cleared, never recovered. His spirit was broken, his fortune was gone, and he died of a massive heart attack shortly after his acquittal. Kennedy walked away from the wreckage richer and more powerful than ever. He had conquered the dream factory. He had forced the moguls of Los Angeles to bend the knee to his Wall Street efficiency and his underworld ruthlessness. Publicly, he was celebrated as a financial savior who had brought order to the chaotic movie business. He posed for photographs with beaming movie stars, the perfect image of an American success story. But as the 1930s dawned, the superficial glamour of Hollywood began to bore him. Controlling the silver screen was an astonishing achievement, but it was still only a simulation of power. Movies could shape culture, but they could not declare war. They could not rewrite history, not declare war. They could not rewrite the laws of banking, and they could not grant the ultimate unassailable legitimacy that his fractured ego still desperately craved. He looked away from the Pacific Ocean and turned his eyes toward the East Coast. He had mastered the art of buying businesses and destroying men. Now, he wanted to buy a country. He wanted to place his hands directly on the levers of the nation. He began to pack his tailored suits, preparing to deploy his massive blood-stained fortune into the most dangerous high-stakes casino of them all, the United States government. And that transition from corporate predator to political kingmaker would require a partnership with a man sitting in the Oval Office, a man who thought he could control the beast from Boston. By the dawn of the 1930s, Joseph Kennedy had conquered Wall Street and pillaged Hollywood, amassing a fortune that insulated him from the catastrophic fallout of the Great Depression. He possessed more liquid capital than the Anglo-Saxon elite could ever dream of. But to them, he was still just an Irish saloon keeper's son. He realized that corporate dominance was essentially a silent victory. A bank account could not command a salute. A real estate portfolio could not rewrite the social hierarchy. To force the American aristocracy to finally bow to him, he needed to buy the only currency that bypassed bloodlines: federal power. He needed to place his hands directly on the levers of the United States government. He approached Washington, D.C. strictly as a hostile corporate takeover, entirely devoid of the civic-minded idealism of a public servant. And the target he selected for his acquisition was the ultimate embodiment of the American establishment: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The contrast between the two was staggering, representing a profound, highly dramatic contradiction in American power. Roosevelt was the quintessential patrician, a descendant of Dutch and English aristocracy who grew up on a sprawling estate in Hyde Park, New York. He radiated effortless, inherited confidence. Kennedy was the aggressive, hyper-vigilant outsider from East Boston. Roosevelt viewed politics as a noble obligation of his class. Kennedy viewed politics as a brutal transaction, a machine where you input cash and extract influence. Kennedy recognized that Roosevelt, preparing for his 1932 presidential run against Herbert Hoover, was desperate for funding. The Great Depression had evaporated the fortunes of many traditional Democratic donors. Kennedy saw a distressed asset. He began pouring a massive stream of cash into Roosevelt's campaign, utilizing his vast network of Hollywood moguls and Wall Street operators to bundle hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Kennedy was not content with merely writing checks. He wanted to be the architect of the victory. The issue here is not that Kennedy supported a presidential candidate. The issue is how he engineered the outcome through backroom extortion and proxy manipulation. During the grueling 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Roosevelt's campaign was stalled. He was bleeding delegates and facing a massive threat from rival candidates. The key to unlocking the nomination rested in the hands of the incredibly powerful, highly controversial newspaper tycoon, William Randolph Hearst. Hearst controlled the critical California and Texas delegations. If Hearst threw his weight behind a rival, Roosevelt's presidential dream would die on the convention floor. Kennedy recognized the bottleneck and deployed his leverage. He had cultivated a close, highly pragmatic relationship with Hearst during his Hollywood days. While Roosevelt's aristocratic advisors wrung their hands in panic, Kennedy picked up a telephone in his hotel suite. He dignified, appealed to Hearst's patriotism. He appealed to Hearst's paranoia. He coldly outlined a narrative warning Hearst that if Roosevelt did not win the nomination, a far more radical left-wing candidate would seize the party and dismantle Hearst's corporate empire. It was a calculated psychological threat delivered with the clinical detachment of a mob boss. The tactic worked. Hearst released his delegates, the convention floor shifted, and Franklin D. Roosevelt secured the nomination. Joseph Kennedy had literally brokered the United States presidency. When Roosevelt won the general election in a historic landslide, Kennedy expected an immediate, spectacular return on his investment. In his transactional worldview, he had bought the president, and now he was owed a seat at the right hand of power. He demanded nothing less than the position of Secretary of the Treasury. He envisioned himself walking into the grand columned halls of the Treasury Department. forcing the Brahmin bankers who had once shunned him to beg for federal bailouts. But here, Kennedy's fatal weakness, his desperate need for elite validation, blinded him to a devastating reality. He completely misunderstood Roosevelt. FDR was a master manipulator in his own right, a man who possessed a charming patrician smile but ruled with a spine of absolute steel. FDR gladly took Kennedy's dirty money, but he had absolutely no intention of letting a notorious stock pool operator and rumored bootlegger control the national treasury. The physical manifestation of this dynamic was humiliating for Kennedy. During the presidential transition, while Roosevelt's inner circle of Ivy League advisors, men like Lewis Howe and Henry Morgenthau Jr., were given sweeping powers, Kennedy was left freezing in the dark. He stalked the hallways of his hotels, his jaw rigidly locked, his face pale with fury. He waited for the phone to ring. It did not. The New York aristocrat had outplayed the Boston street fighter. Roosevelt had taken his capital and simply locked him out of the room. For over a year, Kennedy stewed in a state of absolute venomous rage. He felt the old sting of the Harvard rejection all over again. He had bought the building, but they had still changed the locks. Then, in 1934, Roosevelt made a move of breathtaking political cynicism. The Great Depression was ravaging the country, and the American public was demanding blood from Wall Street. In response, Roosevelt created the Securities and Exchange Commission, a powerful new federal agency designed to ruthlessly police the stock market, outlaw insider trading, and destroy the very stock pools that had caused the 1929 crash. It was meant to be the ultimate regulatory watchdog. To the absolute shock and horror of the American public, the liberal press, and his own closest advisors, Roosevelt announced that the first chairman of the SEC would be Joseph Patrick Kennedy. The backlash was volcanic. Reformers screamed that putting Kennedy in charge of Wall Street was like handing the keys of a bank vault to a convicted bank robber. When his advisors furiously demanded an explanation for why he would appoint one of the most ruthless market manipulators in American history to regulate the market, Roosevelt leaned back in his wheelchair, flashed his trademark grin, and delivered a line of legendary political calculation. Takes a thief to catch a thief. Roosevelt knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that the Ivy League lawyers in Washington did not understand the dark, subterranean plumbing of Wall Street. They didn't know how the money was hidden, how the tipsters were bribed, or how the pools were structured. But Joseph Kennedy knew every single trapdoor because he had built them himself. For Kennedy, the SEC appointment was not a call to public service. It was an opportunity for absolute vengeance. He descended upon Wall Street with the fury of a spurned emperor. He established his headquarters in Washington, physically separating himself from his former associates in New York. The man who had spent the 1920s operating in the shadows now wielded the massive, blinding spotlight of federal subpoena power. His tenure at the SEC physically manifested the grotesque contradiction of his character. Kennedy systematically and mercilessly outlawed the precise mechanisms of financial violence that had made him a multimillionaire. He banned short-selling manipulation. He obliterated the stock pools. He forced corporate executives to disclose their private holdings. He dragged the very men he had previously conspired with into federal hearing rooms and interrogated them under oath. To the American public watching the newsreels in theaters across the country, Kennedy appeared as a heroic reformed sheriff cleaning up a lawless town. They praised his efficiency and his unwavering commitment to the New Deal. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine, hailed as a brilliant financial statesman. But beneath the surface, the reality was entirely different. Kennedy was not protecting the American worker out of a sudden surge of moral clarity. He was pulling up the ladder behind him. By outlawing the methods he had used to get rich, he ensured that no new rivals could ever replicate his explosive rise to power. He was cementing his family's financial supremacy by locking the gates of the very system he had exploited. Furthermore, he used his position as SEC chairman to quietly audit and intimidate the Brahmin banking institutions that had historically refused to do business with him. He was using the United States government as a personal enforcement agency to settle old bitter scores. His tenure at the SEC lasted just over a year, but it was a masterclass in aggressive administrative warfare. He accomplished exactly what Roosevelt needed. He forced Wall Street into submission, and he accomplished exactly what his own fractured ego required. He forced the elite to address him as Mr. Chairman. He had finally rubbed the stench of the bootlegger from his tailored suits. He was no longer just a wealthy Irish operator. He was a nationally recognized, validated member of the federal establishment. He resigned from the SEC in 1935, claiming his work was done, and returned to his massive wealth. But the taste of legitimate power is a terrifying narcotic. Having conquered the regulatory state, Kennedy's ambition mutated into something far more dangerous. Domestic validation was no longer sufficient. He looked at the map of the world, and his eyes fixed on the ultimate prize of international prestige, the epicenter of global aristocracy, London. He demanded that Roosevelt appoint him as the United States ambassador to the court of St. James. He wanted to take his family, his Irish Catholic bloodline, directly into the heart of the British Empire, to walk the halls of Buckingham Palace and force the European monarchy to treat him as an equal. Roosevelt, eager to get the demanding, unpredictable billionaire out of Washington, eventually agreed. In 1938, Joseph Kennedy sailed for England, believing he was embarking on his crowning glory, the final stepping stone that would naturally elevate him to the presidency itself. He believed he was going to London to conquer society. In 1939, the skies over Europe began to darken, presenting Kennedy with a true existential moral test. The geopolitical tectonic plates shifted violently as Adolf Hitler's mechanized armies prepared to march across the continent. Joseph Kennedy was about to step onto the world stage, not as a shrewd banker, but as the representative of American democracy in its darkest hour. The mask of the brilliant statesman was about to be violently ripped away, exposing a dark ideology and profound cowardice that would permanently destroy his presidential dreams and turn his own government against him. In the spring of 1938, Joseph Patrick Kennedy arrived in London, stepping off the ocean liner not merely as a diplomat, but as a conquering emperor. His appointment as the United States ambassador to the court of St. James's was a historical earthquake. For centuries, the British Empire had viewed the Irish as an unruly, subordinate peasant class. Now the son of an East Boston saloon keeper was presenting his credentials directly to King George VI at Buckingham Palace. Kennedy brought his massive photogenic family with him, parading his beautiful wife and 9 children before the flashing cameras of the international press. It was a flawless public relations offensive. To the American public reading the morning papers, it looked like the ultimate triumph of the American dream. The prestige of the title provided Kennedy with top-tier aristocratic validation. Yet, his completely transactional worldview left him unequipped to handle the moral gravity of the office. He had spent his entire adult life operating in the cutthroat, cynical arenas of Wall Street and the bootlegging underworld, where every crisis was just a negotiation and every enemy had a price. He fundamentally believed that human history was driven exclusively by profit margins, leverage, and raw capital. He did not understand ideology. He did not believe in the concept of pure, unadulterated evil. When Kennedy looked across the English Channel and saw the mechanized, terrifying rise of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, he did not see a genocidal fascist regime bent on global domination. He saw a highly efficient, highly aggressive European corporate competitor. Kennedy immediately bypassed the career diplomats at the American embassy and aligned himself completely with the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain was the architect of appeasement, a policy predicated on giving Hitler whatever territory he demanded in exchange for a promise of peace. Kennedy embraced this policy not out of a pacifist desire to save human lives, but out of a cold Wall Street pragmatism. In Kennedy's mind, going to war with Germany would inevitably disrupt global markets, destroy international trade routes, and threaten his own massive offshore fortune. He sent highly confidential cables back to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, aggressively arguing that the United States must stay out of European affairs at all costs. He treated the survival of independent European nations as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of economic stability. This is how Kennedy exercised his diplomatic power. He weaponized American intelligence to force an isolationist agenda. He actively undermined the anti-fascist factions within the British government, routinely leaking sensitive information to isolationist politicians back in Washington to prevent Roosevelt from preparing the American military for the inevitable conflict. He was operating as a rogue agent, believing that his billionaire instincts were vastly superior to the geopolitical strategy of the president who had appointed him. Kennedy's psychological decay surfaced undeniably when the policy of appeasement spectacularly collapsed. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Great Britain declared war. The illusion of a negotiated peace was incinerated. Neville Chamberlain was ousted in disgrace, and Winston Churchill, a man who truly understood the apocalyptic threat of Nazism, ascended to the role of Prime Minister. The dynamic between Joseph Kennedy and Winston Churchill was an immediate, visceral collision of two irreconcilable worldviews. Churchill was an aristocrat, but he was driven by a profound romantic belief in the moral destiny of the British Empire and the absolute necessity of destroying tyranny. Kennedy despised him. Kennedy viewed Churchill as a washed-up, arrogant relic of the 19th century who was drunk on his own rhetoric. Churchill, in turn, instantly recognized the terrifying void at the center of the American ambassador's character. He saw a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. As the war escalated, the terrifying reality of modern mechanized conflict arrived on the shores of England. The Luftwaffe began its campaign of aerial annihilation, targeting London in what would become known as the Blitz. Night after night, the sky screamed with the sound of falling bombs. Entire city blocks were reduced to smoking rubble. Thousands of British civilians were ripped apart in the streets. The true test of a leader is physical courage in the face of indiscriminate death. In this ultimate crucible, Joseph Kennedy completely lost his nerve. The gap between the prestigious, powerful title he demanded and the cowardly reality of his character was blown wide open. While King George VI and Queen Elizabeth adamantly refused to leave Buckingham Palace, enduring direct bomb strikes to show solidarity with their people, while Winston Churchill stubbornly walked through the smoking, shattered streets of the East End, chomping his cigar and flashing the victory sign to terrified, ash-covered citizens. The United States ambassador packed his bespoke suits and fled. Kennedy was absolutely paralyzed by the fear of physical harm. He could not comprehend risking his own life for a philosophical concept like democracy. Every evening, before the air raid sirens even began to wail across the Capitol, Kennedy would abandon the American embassy in Grosvenor Square. He ordered his chauffeur to drive him deep into the English countryside, to a sprawling, heavily fortified rented mansion called Wall Hall in Hertfordshire, nearly 30 miles away from the danger. He would sleep in total safety, surrounded by manicured lawns and private security, while the people he was supposed to be allied with were burning in the inferno of London. The British public, enduring unimaginable suffering, quickly noticed the daily exodus of the American ambassador's limousine. The working-class citizens who were sleeping in damp, crowded subway tunnels while their homes were obliterated viewed Kennedy with a mixture of profound disgust and open contempt. The British press quietly, viciously nicknamed him Jittery Joe. It was the ultimate shattering humiliation. The man who had spent his entire life trying to force the aristocracy to respect him was now universally recognized by an entire nation as an undisputed coward. Kennedy's physical retreat to the countryside perfectly mirrored his diplomatic retreat from reality. Safe within the walls of his country estate, completely isolated from the bleeding city, he began to send a barrage of deeply pessimistic, defeatist cables directly to President Roosevelt. He did not offer analysis, he offered a eulogy for a nation that was still fighting for its life. He flatly told the President of the United States that Great Britain was doomed. He argued vehemently against sending American military aid, specifically opposing the crucial Lend-Lease program. In his chilling mathematical assessment, sending weapons or financial support to Churchill was simply throwing good money after bad. He viewed Britain as a bankrupt corporation that was about to be liquidated by the German war machine. He advised Roosevelt to cut his losses, let Europe fall, and focus entirely on negotiating a trade agreement with the victorious Nazi regime. But Kennedy's hubris drove him even further into the dark. He was not satisfied with merely advising the president. He attempted to seize control of global diplomacy himself. Without any authorization from the State Department and in direct violation of the Logan Act, Kennedy quietly reached out to his vast network of international financiers and corporate operatives to try and establish a secret back-channel meeting with Adolf Hitler. He genuinely believed that if he could just sit in a room with the Führer man-to-man, billionaire to dictator, he could broker a grand corporate settlement to carve up the global markets and end the war on a spreadsheet. He was treating the greatest existential crisis in human history exactly the same way he had treated the hostile takeover of a Boston bank. He believed he could buy out the Third Reich. When intelligence of these unauthorized diplomatic maneuverings reached the Oval Office, Franklin D. Roosevelt was apoplectic. The president realized that his ambassador to the United Kingdom was not merely a coward, he was an active, terrifying liability to the survival of the free world. Roosevelt began systematically bypassing Kennedy, communicating directly with Winston Churchill through secure, encrypted naval channels. Kennedy was effectively neutered, left to sit in his country estate, issuing commands that no one followed, and sending telegrams that the president simply ignored. The psychological toll of this marginalization on Kennedy was immense. The supreme manipulator had been entirely cut out of the greatest global conflict of the century. He realized that his dream of using the ambassadorship as a direct springboard to the presidency was disintegrating. By the autumn of 1940, as Roosevelt campaigned for an unprecedented third term, he finally recalled his rogue ambassador back to the United States. Roosevelt needed Kennedy to publicly endorse him to secure the crucial Irish Catholic vote in the Northeast, and he practically had to bribe and threaten Kennedy to secure the endorsement. Kennedy returned to American shores, seething with a dark, bitter resentment. He had been humiliated in London, sidelined by the president, and mocked by the international press. He felt cornered, angry, and desperate to reassert his intellectual superiority over a world that was refusing to listen to his defeatist logic. His actions in Europe went far deeper than the misguided pragmatism of a hardcore isolationist. He had absorbed the darkest ideologies of the European continent, and he was completely unable to keep his mouth shut. In late 1940, believing himself to be untouchable, Joseph Kennedy sat down in a hotel room in Boston for a series of interviews with prominents and journalists. And in those rooms, he stripped away the final veneer of diplomatic tact. He was about to articulate a worldview so toxic and reveal a virulent, calculated prejudice so grotesque that it would force the president's hand, destroy his own political career forever, and place a permanent, unforgivable stain on the legacy of his family. In November 1940, Joseph Patrick Kennedy sat inside a luxurious, sprawling suite at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston. He had just returned from a war-torn Europe, leaving behind a British population huddling in subway tunnels while the Luftwaffe reduced their capital to ash. Yet, sitting in his tailored suit, eating a lavish room service meal of oysters and steak, Kennedy felt no survivor's guilt. He felt an overwhelming, arrogant vindication. He believed his defeatist assessments had been entirely correct. He invited several prominent journalists, including Louis Lyons of the Boston Globe, up to his suite for what he assumed would be a friendly, off-the-record chat. Kennedy believed he was the smartest man in the room. This was his fatal weakness manifesting in real time. An absolute, blinding hubris that made him incapable of reading the room or understanding the moral revulsion he was about to trigger. He treated the journalists not as an independent press, but as his personal public relations employees. He slouched in an armchair, completely relaxed, and proceeded to casually incinerate his own political career. Democracy is finished in England, Kennedy bluntly told the reporters. He stated it not as a tragedy, but as a cold, unavoidable mathematical fact. He went further, suggesting that if the United States entered the war, democracy would be finished in America as well. He argued that to fight fascism, the American government would have to become a totalitarian state itself, so the only logical business decision was to stay out of it and negotiate with Adolf Hitler. But the political cowardice of declaring Democrats dead was only the surface of the rot. As the interview continued, Kennedy stripped away his diplomatic mask and revealed a worldview so deeply infected with prejudice that it stunned the journalists sitting across from him. His desperate drive to be accepted by the Anglo-Saxon elite resulted in him adopting their most aristocratic prejudices, amplifying them through his own transactional cruelty. He did not possess a moral compass. He possessed a balance sheet, and in his terrifying calculus, the Jewish people were simply a global liability. Historical archives and decrypted diplomatic cables reveal a chilling pattern of behavior during his time in London. Before the outbreak of war, Kennedy held highly secret, unauthorized meetings with Herbert von Dirksen, the German ambassador to the United Kingdom. In these meetings, Kennedy did not deliver warnings from the American government. Instead, he attempted to build a rapport. According to Dirksen's official reports back to Berlin, Kennedy explicitly stated that he understood the Nazis' Jewish policy. Kennedy told the German ambassador that the only problem with Hitler's treatment of the Jews was that it was too noisy, creating a public relations nightmare that was aggravating the American press and making it difficult for Kennedy to advocate for appeasement. The United States ambassador was not objecting to the systematic persecution of millions of people. He was objecting to the bad press it generated, which was complicating his desire to broker a trade deal with a fascist dictator. It is a stunning display of moral bankruptcy. He viewed the impending Holocaust as a mere public relations friction point. His anti-Semitism was not passive. It was a deeply ingrained political strategy. Behind closed doors and increasingly in front of shocked diplomats, Kennedy frequently utilized horrific, bigoted language, complaining that Jewish influence in the media and in President Roosevelt's inner circle was dragging the United States into an unnecessary conflict. He blamed the victims. He routinely expressed the grotesque sentiment that the Jewish people in Europe had brought their persecution upon themselves through their own economic behavior. This terrifying lack of basic human empathy culminated in his logistical approach to the escalating refugee crisis. As thousands of German and Austrian Jews desperately tried to flee the tightening grip of the Third Reich, the American and British governments debated how to handle the influx. Kennedy's solution was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. He actively championed proposals to prevent Jewish refugees from entering the United States or Great Britain, arguing that their arrival would disrupt the social order and hurt the economy. Instead, he aligned himself with monstrous, early logistical concepts that mirrored the Nazis' own initial deportation strategies. Kennedy advocated for a plan to load Jewish refugees onto ships and forcibly relocate them to remote, undeveloped colonial outposts in Africa, stripping these desperate men, women, and children of their humanity. He treated them like a massive shipment of defective cargo that needed to be warehoused in a desert to keep the Western supply chains moving smoothly. It was a sterile corporate approach to ethnic cleansing. Back in the Ritz-Carlton suite, Kennedy continued to spout his defeatist, prejudiced rhetoric, believing the journalists were nodding in agreement. He was entirely disconnected from the reality of the American public. He assumed that because he was a billionaire, his opinions were infallible. He was wrong. Louis Lyons, recognizing the explosive magnitude of what he was hearing, decided that the public had a right to know the true face of their ambassador. He defied Kennedy's assumption of off-the-record privilege and published the interview in the Boston Globe. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The article was syndicated nationwide. The American public, even those who leaned heavily toward isolationism, were completely repulsed by the sheer, unfeeling callousness of Kennedy's words. To declare democracy dead while British citizens were pulling bodies out of the rubble was an unforgivable insult to human courage. The revelation of his defeatism and his underlying prejudices confirmed the darkest suspicions of the liberal press and the Roosevelt administration. When the newspaper landed on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's desk in the Oval Office, the reaction was not panic. It was a cold, calculating execution. Roosevelt had long known that Kennedy was a treacherous, self-serving liability, but Roosevelt was in the middle of a brutal campaign for an unprecedented third term as president. He was facing a strong Republican challenger, and he desperately needed the massive, monolithic voting bloc of the Irish Catholic Northeast. He knew that if he fired Kennedy before the election, Kennedy would publicly endorse the Republicans out of sheer spite, potentially costing Roosevelt the presidency. So, Roosevelt orchestrated a masterpiece of political manipulation that completely outplayed the great Wall Street manipulator. Roosevelt summoned Kennedy to the White House. The physical dynamic of this meeting is legendary. Roosevelt, paralyzed by polio, sat anchored in his wheelchair behind the massive Resolute desk. Kennedy, tall, athletic, and boiling with rage over the Boston Globe leak, paced the floor. Kennedy intended to use the meeting to demand more power, threatening to withhold his endorsement if Roosevelt didn't guarantee him a central role in the administration. But Roosevelt did not negotiate. He used his patrician charm like a scalpel. He appealed to Kennedy's colossal ego, implying that Kennedy's endorsement was the single most important factor in the survival of the nation. He promised nothing concrete, but he expertly stroked Kennedy's vanity until the ambassador finally caved. Kennedy agreed to go on national radio and deliver a PA rhyme-time speech aggressively endorsing Roosevelt for a third term. Kennedy paid for the airtime out of his own pocket, believing he was purchasing the ultimate political leverage. On election night, November 1940, Roosevelt won in a landslide. He secured his third term. The Irish Catholic vote held strong, heavily influenced by Kennedy's radio address. The very next morning, the political guillotine dropped. Roosevelt no longer needed Joseph Kennedy. The distressed asset had been fully utilized and was now entirely toxic. Roosevelt's inner circle immediately froze Kennedy out. His calls to the White House went unanswered. The president sent a brief, icy communication making it abundantly clear that Kennedy's services were no longer required by the United States government. The message was unmistakable. Resign immediately, or you will be publicly fired. Kennedy had no choice. He submitted his resignation, attempting to spin it to the press as a voluntary departure to focus on his family. But the entire political establishment knew the truth. He had been used, manipulated, and discarded by a master politician who saw right through his bespoke suits and his billions of dollars. For Joseph Kennedy, the psychological devastation was absolute. He retreated to his massive estate in Palm Beach, locking himself away from the public eye. The physical manifestation of his defeat was stark. He sat on his sun-drenched patio, staring blankly at the ocean, his jaw rigidly clenched. He realized with terrifying clarity that the grand defining ambition of his life was permanently dead. He would never be the president of the United States. His public image was incinerated. He was viewed by the elite as a fascist sympathizing coward, and by the working class as an arrogant, out-of-touch plutocrat. The doors of the White House, the doors of the establishment, and the doors of history had been slammed in his face and bolted shut from the inside. He had amassed one of the greatest fortunes in human history, but he could not buy the one thing he wanted most. But Joseph Kennedy was not a man who accepted defeat. He simply relocated the battlefield. If he could not take the oath of office himself, he would build a machine that could. He looked away from his own ruined reflection and turned his terrifying, unyielding focus onto the 9 children playing on the lawns of his compounds. He could not wear the crown, but he could breed the monarch. Up to this point, his cruelty had been directed outward at rival bankers, theater owners, and foreign populations. But now, all of that concentrated, venomous ambition turned inward. He was about to transform his family homes into ruthless psychological war zones. He was about to build a political boot camp that would strip his children of their individuality and forge them into weapons of mass political destruction. And in doing so, he would set the stage for the greatest dynasty and the most horrific tragedies in American political history. The gates of the Kennedy compounds in Hyannisport, Massachusetts, and Palm Beach, Florida, presented a flawless, sun-drenched illusion to the American public. If you looked at the glossy spreads in Life magazine, you saw the ultimate distillation of aristocratic health and vigor. You saw a handsome patriarch surrounded by 9 beautiful, athletic children playing touch football on the sprawling lawns, sailing yachts on the shimmering Atlantic, and flashing brilliant, identical smiles. But the gap between how the public perceived these estates and the inner reality of the people living inside them was a terrifying canyon. These were not family homes. They were high-security political boot camps. They were psychological war zones where the children were systematically stripped of their individuality and reassembled into highly specialized, interchangeable weapons of mass political destruction. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had realized that the American establishment would never allow him, T, sit in the Oval Office. His reputation was entirely too toxic, his prejudices too public, and his cowardice too well documented. Recognizing he could never wear the crown himself, he decided to become the supreme kingmaker. He would pour every ounce of his massive, blood-stained fortune and every dark strategy he had learned from Wall Street and the underworld into his sons. He would purchase the presidency through his own bloodline. To achieve this, he had to eradicate weakness from his children. And in the Kennedy household, weakness was defined as anything short of absolute victory. The physical manifestation of this relentless psychological pressure was centered in the dining room. Meals at Hyannisport were not occasions for familial warmth or casual conversation. The dining table was a Roman Colosseum, and Joseph Kennedy sat at the head as the undisputed emperor. When the children sat down, small talk was strictly prohibited. Emotion was considered a severe liability. Instead, the patriarch transformed dinner into a brutal rapid-fire interrogation on global geopolitics, macroeconomic theory, and domestic policy. He would pin a child with his cold, unblinking glare and demand they defend a political position. If they hesitated, if they stuttered, or if their argument lacked aggressive conviction, he would humiliate them in front of the entire family. He was teaching them not how to think, but how to dominate a room. He imposed a terrifying binary code on their young minds. He famously told them, "We don't want any losers around here. In this family, we want winners." Coming in second place in a sailing regatta or swimming race was treated not as a sporting disappointment, but as a profound moral failure. He created an environment where his children believed right down to their marrow that their father's love was entirely conditional. It was a currency that had to be purchased with trophies, high grades, and dominance. To lose was to risk being emotionally exiled from the only man whose opinion mattered. He explicitly forbade crying. Kennedys never cry. He would bark at a bruised or heartbroken child. He was meticulously cauterizing their tear ducts, ensuring they would never show vulnerability to the American public. The primary vessel for this staggering, suffocating ambition was the eldest son, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. Joe Jr. was the designated golden boy. He was tall, athletic, fiercely competitive, and possessed the loud, booming charisma that his father prized. From the moment the boy could walk, Joe Sr. explicitly told him that he was destined to be the first Catholic president of the United States. It was not a suggestion. It was an imperial decree. Joe Jr. internalized this crushing expectation perfectly. He became a hyper-vigilant proxy for his father's ego. He understood that he was the tip of the family spear. But the psychological trap Joseph Kennedy built for his eldest son was lethal. By raising Joe Jr. to believe that his entire worth was tied to achieving a political supremacy that his father had failed to reach, he effectively turned the boy into a human sacrifice on the altar of the family brand. The true tragedy of this dynamic was catalyzed by the deliberate manufactured rivalry with the second son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Jack was everything Joe Jr. was not. Jack was chronically ill, suffering from a myriad of hidden physical ailments. He loved literature, he was rebellious, and he possessed a detached, ironic wit that deeply irritated his father. But Joe Sr. did not separate his sons to let them grow into their own identities. He actively pitted them against each other in a vicious, high-stakes gladiatorial combat. He wanted them to fight. He wanted them to sharpen their claws on each other's flesh. He would openly compare them at the dinner table, praising Joe Jr.'s athletic dominance, while mocking Jack's physical frailty. He engineered ruthless sporting competitions, forcing them to race sailboats in dangerous weather, watching from the shore as the brothers practically ran each other into the rocks to avoid the humiliation of coming in second. The physical manifestation of this manufactured hatred was often violent. The two brothers frequently engaged in brutal, bloody fistfights, trying to batter each other into submission, simply to win a nod of approval from the cold, calculating man sitting in his study. This engineered psychological warfare culminated in absolute disaster during the Second World War. When the United States entered the global conflict, military service was no longer a patriotic duty. For the Kennedys, it was a mandatory political resume builder. A future president had to be a war hero. Both brothers enlisted in the Navy, but history delivered a shocking, unscripted plot twist. In August 1943, Jack Kennedy, the sickly, bookish younger brother, was commanding a patrol torpedo boat PT-109 in the Pacific. A Japanese destroyer rammed his boat, slicing it in half. Despite severe injuries to his back, Jack heroically towed a badly burned crewmate through miles of open ocean to safety. The story was picked up by the American press. Jack Kennedy became an overnight national sensation, a genuine, undisputed war hero. For Joe Jr., sitting on a naval base in Europe, the news of his younger brother's heroism was not a cause for celebration. It was a psychological death sentence. The conditioning his father had drilled into him since birth immediately activated. Joe Jr. could not be second. He could not be overshadowed by the sickly younger brother he was supposed to dominate. The public adoration pouring in for Jack meant that Joe Jr. was losing the only race that mattered, the race to the White House. He was consumed by an agonizing, blinding jealousy and an absolute terror of disappointing his father. Driven by this desperate, manufactured need to reclaim his status as the Supreme Kennedy, Joe Jr. began volunteering for increasingly grouse, reckless combat missions. He needed a medal. He needed a headline. He needed to prove to the patriarch that he was still the king. In August 1944, he volunteered for Operation Aphrodite. It was essentially a suicide mission. The military plan called for stripping a massive B-24 bomber of all its armor, packing it with 21,000 pounds of highly volatile Torpex explosives, and flying it directly at a fortified German bunker in France. The pilots were supposed to arm the explosives in midair and then parachute out of the flying bomb just before it crossed the English Channel, allowing a trailing plane to guide it to the target via rudimentary radio control. It was experimental, terrifying, and highly prone to catastrophic failure, but it offered the ultimate glory. Joe Jr. did not volunteer out of a profound sense of American patriotism. He volunteered because his father's psychological architecture demanded it. He climbed into the cockpit of that flying bomb because he was more afraid of looking like a failure in the dining room at Hyannisport than he was of dying. On August 12, 1944, Joseph Kennedy Jr. took off from an airfield in England. Before he and his co-pilot could reach the designated bailout zone, the primitive electrical arming system malfunctioned. While still over the English countryside, 21,000 pounds of explosives detonated simultaneously. The explosion was so massive it shattered windows miles away. The airplane was instantly vaporized. There was no wreckage to recover. There were no bodies to bring home. The golden boy, the vessel of all his father's thwarted ambitions, was simply erased from the sky. When the military chaplains arrived at the compound in Hyannisport to deliver the news, the reaction of Joseph Kennedy Sr. was chilling. This was the moment the bill for his ruthless parenting came due. The man who had built an empire by manipulating markets and destroying rivals was completely shattered by the death of his namesake. He locked himself in his bedroom. For one of the few times in his life, the patriarch was physically broken. But the mourning period in the Kennedy household was terrifyingly brief. There was no time to properly process the grief because the political machine could not afford to stop running. Within weeks, the tears were dried, the emotional vault was locked shut, and Joseph Kennedy Sr. emerged from his room. He did not rethink his strategy. He did not reflect on how his unrelenting pressure had driven his son into a flying bomb. Instead, he simply adjusted his ledger. He walked directly to John F. Kennedy, the grieving, physically shattered younger brother who had just lost his greatest rival, and pointed a metaphorical gun at his head. The burden of the presidency, the crushing weight of the dynasty, was instantly and ruthlessly transferred. "It is now your responsibility," Joe Sr. decreed. Jack, who had never wanted to be a politician, who had dreamed of being a writer or a journalist, was given no choice. He was drafted into his father's war. The patriarch was sharpening his remaining son for public office with surgical precision. He would teach Jack how to smile for the cameras, how to debate opponents, and how to project the illusion of flawless American royalty. But while he was molding them into public titans, he was simultaneously destroying their private moral compasses. The lessons Joseph Kennedy taught his sons behind closed doors about the absolute disposability of human beings, the transaction of marriage, and the entitlement to do whatever they wanted with women were about to create a deep, festering rot. It was a moral decay that he would actively encourage, a poison that would infect the dynasty from the inside out and leave a trail of broken lives in the shadows of Camelot. The political architecture of Camelot, with all its soaring rhetoric about public service and moral courage, was built upon a foundation of profound, deeply ingrained moral rot. The American public was sold a meticulously crafted illusion of a devout traditional Catholic family. They saw the patriarch and the matriarch leading their beautiful children to Sunday Mass. the very picture of wholesome aristocratic grace. But the gap between this shimmering public perception and the terrifying inner reality of the Kennedy household was vast and toxic. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. did not merely construct a political machine, he constructed an environment of absolute psychological dominance. And nowhere was his need for absolute psychological dominance more evident than in his treatment of women. The issue here is not simply that a wealthy, powerful man engaged in extramarital affairs. The history of the world is littered with unfaithful politicians and philandering billionaires. The issue is how Joseph Kennedy weaponized his infidelity. He did not engage in secret romances driven by passion or a search for emotional connection. For Kennedy, women were not human beings. They were luxury assets. They were living, breathing trophies meant to be acquired, consumed, and displayed to validate his own supreme power. His approach to intimacy was exactly the same as his approach to Wall Street. It was a hostile takeover. The first and perhaps most tragic acquisition of his life was his own wife, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. Rose was the beloved, highly educated daughter of John F. and Honey Fitzgerald, the charismatic, deeply entrenched mayor of Boston. When Joseph Kennedy pursued Rose, he was not primarily driven by romance. He was executing a strategic merger. By marrying the mayor's daughter, the ambitious, socially insecure son of a saloon keeper instantly acquired the ultimate political pedigree in Irish Catholic Boston. Rose provided him with the social armor he desperately needed. But once she had fulfilled her primary function, providing him with legitimacy and producing a sprawling brood of heirs, Kennedy emotionally discarded her. He expected absolute submission. Rose, raised in a strict, deeply religious environment, was forced to accept a horrifying marital bargain. She would be granted immense wealth, global travel, and the title of matriarch, but she had to completely surrender her dignity. Her survival mechanism was chilling. She developed a terrifying frozen smile. She retreated into a rigid, obsessive devotion to the Catholic Church, taking long, solitary walks along the beach, deliberately blinding herself to the reality of the monster she had married. She mastered the art of looking the other way, because acknowledging the truth would have shattered her entire world. Joseph Kennedy viewed his wife's silent endurance not as a tragedy, but as a victory. It emboldened him to push his cruelty to staggering extremes. By the late 1920s, as he was aggressively conquering the Hollywood studio system, he set his sights on the ultimate prize of the cinematic world, Gloria Swanson. At the time, Gloria Swanson was the highest paid, most famous, and most glamorous actress on the planet. She was an international icon. Kennedy did not just want to sleep with her. He wanted to own her entirely. He approached her as a financier, offering to become her personal business manager and produce her films through his own company. Swanson, navigating the chaotic transition from silent films to talkies, accepted. It was the worst mistake of her life. Kennedy completely consumed her. He took over her bank accounts, her film productions, and her private life. He initiated a brazen, highly publicized affair with the actress, parading her around Hollywood and New York. He orchestrated the production of a massively expensive, disastrous silent film titled Queen Kelly, which ultimately collapsed under Kennedy's heavy-handed interference and the changing demands of the sound era, causing Swanson massive financial and professional damage. But the true grotesque depravity of the Swanson affair lay in how Kennedy used his mistress to actively torture his wife. He possessed a sadistic need to demonstrate his absolute control over every human being in his orbit. He was not content with keeping his mistress in California and his wife in Massachusetts. He forced the two worlds to collide. Kennedy repeatedly brought Gloria Swanson into the family's private sanctuaries. He demanded that Rose host Swanson at their estates. In an act of breathtaking psychological cruelty, he arranged for his wife, his mistress, and himself to travel together on extended European vacations. The vivid visual of this arrangement is horrifying to contemplate. The cold, calculating American banker, the flamboyant Hollywood goddess, and the silent, deeply humiliated Catholic wife, all sitting together in the first-class cabins of ocean liners and on the sun-drenched decks of private yachts. Kennedy demanded that Rose sit there, perfectly dressed, and endure the presence of the woman who was sleeping with her husband, without uttering a single syllable of complaint. If she challenged him, he threatened to cut off her funding and destroy her social standing. He forced his wife to swallow her pride simply to prove to himself that he was a god who answered to no one. And when the affair eventually ended, when Swanson's financial usefulness dried up and the novelty of conquering a movie star wore off, Kennedy abruptly abandoned her, leaving the actress deeply in debt and professionally wounded. He moved on to other conquests without a backward glance. This transactional, predatory behavior was his standard operating procedure. He later engaged in an affair with another global icon, the sultry, mysterious German actress Marlene Dietrich. For Kennedy, sleeping with Dietrich was the equivalent of hanging a priceless painting in his boardroom. It was a tangible metric of his superiority. But if Joseph Kennedy had merely been a cruel husband, the damage would have been contained to his own generation. The true catastrophe of his moral decay was that it was highly contagious. He did not hide his sociopathic behavior from his sons. He weaponized it as an educational tool. A normal father attempts to shield his children from his deepest flaws. Joseph Kennedy flaunted them. He turned the dining rooms and the locker rooms of his compounds into seminars on toxic masculinity. He actively poisoned the moral compasses of his sons, particularly Joe Jr. and John F. Kennedy. He explicitly instructed his boys that monogamy was an outdated, pathetic weakness designed for the lower classes. He taught them that powerful men were entirely entitled to consume women, and that the sheer volume of their sexual conquests was a direct reflection of their political and personal vitality. He bred a terrifying emotional detachment into the future leaders of the country. In the Kennedy worldview, meticulously programmed by the patriarch, women were strictly divided into two distinct non-intersecting categories. The first category consisted of the pristine, aristocratic, long-suffering wives. Women exactly like their mother, Rose, and eventually women like Jacqueline Bouvier. These women were necessary for producing legitimate heirs, hosting state dinners, and providing the flawless imagery required for political brochures. They were expected to be loyal, elegant, and entirely silent about their husbands' betrayals. The second category consisted of everyone else: secretaries, actresses, campaign volunteers, and prostitutes. These women were deemed utterly disposable, mere objects to be used for physical gratification, and then immediately discarded. Jack Kennedy, the man destined to become the defining hero of a generation, internalized this toxic lesson perfectly. Behind the glowing mythological imagery of the Kennedy White House, Jack operated with a cold, frantic, almost mechanical promiscuity that directly mirrored his father's dark teachings. He treated the bodies of the women around him as entitlements of his office. The ultimate grotesque crossover between the father's decay and the son's inheritance occurred years later. When Jack Kennedy was the President of the United States, he invited Marlene Dietrich, his father's former mistress, into the private quarters of the White House. The gap between the public reverence for the presidency and the private reality of the men holding it was absolute. And as the aging actress was preparing to leave his bedroom, Jack Kennedy revealed the true, deeply disturbed motivation behind the encounter. His primary question to her wasn't about her life, or art, or politics. He looked at her and explicitly asked if she had ever slept with his father. When she lied and said no, Jack Kennedy smiled, visibly satisfied. It was a sick, competitive verification of power. He wasn't making love. He was settling a score with the ghost of his patriarch. He was proving that he could conquer the same territory as the man who had tormented him. Joseph Kennedy had successfully taught his sons to separate their public divinity from their private depravity. They had learned how to smile brilliantly for the cameras, champion civil rights on television, and then walk into a back room and treat human beings as disposable tissue. This philosophy of erasure, of making inconvenient people disappear, of silencing them through intimidation or wealth, worked flawlessly when dealing with mistresses, rival businessmen, and political opponents. The Kennedys believed they could simply buy their way out of any moral consequence. But this philosophy was about to collide with a terrifying reality. While affairs could be hushed up and bribes paid, a fundamental flaw in the perfect genetic sequence of the Kennedy family threatened the entire illusion. A vulnerability that could not be trained away on the football field, could not be bought off with a trust fund, and could not be hidden by the best public relations men in Washington. There was a threat living inside the walls of their own compound, a threat to the flawless aristocratic image that Joseph Kennedy was preparing to present to the American voters. And to solve this ultimate public relations problem, the patriarch would not use his checkbook, and he would not use his charm. He would use a surgeon's blade. In the winter of 1941, the overarching political objective of Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. was running into a massive, unpredictable roadblock. He had successfully transferred the immense, crushing weight of his dynastic ambitions onto his remaining sons. John F. Kennedy was being groomed for public office, his war hero narrative was being carefully cultivated, and the family's multi-billion-dollar financial apparatus was fully mobilized to buy the necessary leverage in Washington. Every single aspect of the family's public image was being polished to a mirror sheen to present the American electorate with a flawless, invincible aristocracy. But inside the private walls of the compound, a deep, terrifying vulnerability was threatening to blow the entire illusion apart. That vulnerability was his third child, his eldest daughter, Rosemary. What occurred next represents the calculated dehumanization of a family member to protect a political brand. A father looked at his own flesh and blood, a young woman who needed patience and specialized care, and saw only a public relations crisis that needed to be surgically eliminated. Rosemary Kennedy, born in 1918, had suffered from mild intellectual disabilities since birth. Due to a tragic medical delay during her delivery, her brain had been temporarily deprived of oxygen. As she grew, she struggled to keep pace with the hyper-competitive, high-velocity environment her father demanded. She could not read at the same level as her siblings. She could not sprint as fast on the sports fields, and she could not participate in the rapid-fire political interrogations at the dinner table. But for the first 2 decades of her life, her mother, Rose, and her siblings managed to protect her, weaving her into the family structure, ensuring she was included in social gatherings and family photographs. Rosemary was affectionate, vibrant, and deeply eager to please the imposing patriarch whose love she could never quite earn. But as she reached her early 20s, the physical and psychological reality of her condition began to shift. Rosemary was growing into a beautiful, physically mature young woman. She began to experience severe, volatile mood swings and episodes of intense frustration, driven largely by her own awareness that she could never meet her father's impossible standards of perfection. She began to rebel against the suffocating confinement of the family estates. She would slip away from her caretakers at night, wandering the streets of Washington or Boston, seeking the company of strangers, searching for the warmth and acceptance that were completely absent from her transactional home. For Joseph Kennedy, tracking his daughter's movements from his study, this behavior was a blaring red alert siren. His psychological weakness, his obsessive consuming fear of public exposure and social humiliation, instantly overrode any basic paternal instinct. He did not see a vulnerable daughter crying out for help. He saw a ticking social time bomb. In the rigid, highly prejudiced social landscape of mid-century America, having a child with intellectual disabilities or mental health struggles was viewed by the upper classes as a profound genetic stain. It was whispered about as a sign of hereditary rot. Kennedy knew with absolute certainty that if the press discovered Rosemary wandering the streets, or worse, if she became pregnant out of wedlock, the political career of John F. Kennedy and every other son would be instantly incinerated before it even began. The American public would never elect a man whose family possessed what the voters would deem tainted blood. Rosemary's very existence was a direct existential threat to the dynasty he was trying to build. He decided she had to be silenced. He did not look for a specialized school, a quiet farm, or a medical retreat where she could live out her life in peace. He looked for a permanent industrial solution to a public relations problem. In 1941, Kennedy's search for a quick fix led him to Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts. Freeman was an ambitious, highly controversial neurologist who was aggressively crisscrossing the country promoting a radical, deeply disturbing new neurological procedure called the prefrontal lobotomy. Freeman claimed that by surgically destroying the connective tissue in the frontal lobes of the brain, he could instantly cure aggression, erratic behavior, and mental instability. To the scientific establishment, the procedure was unproven, highly dangerous, and widely considered an act of medical barbarism. But to Joseph Kennedy, looking at the promotional pamphlets, it sounded like the perfect corporate liquidation. It was a way to permanently turn off his daughter's disruptive behavior. The sheer chilling depravity of his execution of this decision is staggering. Kennedy did not inform his wife, Rose. He did not tell his other children. Operating in absolute clinical secrecy, he personally scheduled the surgery for November 1941 at George Washington University Hospital. He drove his 23-year-old daughter to the clinic himself, treating her exactly like a piece of defective machinery being returned to a factory for a forced modification. The physical reality of that operating room is a nightmare, anchored in a historical fact. Rosemary was not put under general anesthesia. She was kept entirely awake under local sedation because Dr. Freeman required her active feedback to know how much of her brain to destroy. The surgeons drilled 2 neat holes directly into the sides of her skull. Then, Freeman inserted a long, narrow steel instrument, a leucotomy, blindly into her brain tissue to gauge the depth and destination of the cuts. Freeman began to ask Rosemary simple questions. He asked her to recite the alphabet. He asked her to count backward from 100. He asked her to sing "God Bless America." The young woman sat on the operating table, her skull open, singing the patriotic anthem into the sterile air while her father waited out in the corridor. Freeman swung the steel blade back and forth, slicing through the neural pathways of her frontal lobe. With each pass of the knife, they listened to her voice. They only stopped cutting when her speech began to slur, when her count broke down, and when her singing finally degenerated into an incoherent childish grunt. The light in her eyes simply went out. The procedure was a catastrophic failure of science, but a total success for Joseph Kennedy's public relations strategy. Rosemary was completely destroyed. The vibrant, rebellious 23-year-old woman was instantly reduced to the mental capacity of a 2-year-old child. She could no longer feed herself. She could no longer control her bodily functions. She could no longer walk straight, and she had lost the ability to formulate a single, coherent sentence. She was a physical shell, a ghost haunting her own ruined body. If Kennedy had possessed a single shred of human conscience, the sight of his mutilated daughter would have broken him. It did not. He looked at the wreckage of her mind and immediately moved to the final phase of the corporate liquidation, the complete erasure of her existence. He did not bring her home to Hyannisport to be cared for by her family. He could not risk his other children or the household staff seeing what he had done. He immediately shipped Rosemary to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Washington, and later transferred her to St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children, a highly isolated remote institution run by Catholic nuns in the rural wilderness of Jefferson, Wisconsin. He gave the nuns an absolute iron-clad instruction. Rosemary was never to be seen by the public. She was never to leave the grounds, and her true identity was to be guarded like a state secret. Then Joseph Kennedy walked out of the institution, climbed into his limousine, and simply erased her from his ledger. For the next 20 years of his life, until his own physical collapse, Joseph Kennedy Sr. never went to visit her. Not once. He never sent her a letter. He never held her hand. He threw his own daughter into a locked ward in the Midwest and entirely deleted her from the family narrative. When the other children asked where their sister had gone, Joe Sr. lied to them, coldly stating that she had become reclusive and had chosen to go work as a teacher for disabled children in a distant convent. He explicitly forbade the family from mentioning her name. Rose Kennedy, when she eventually discovered the truth years later, accepted the decree with her trademark frozen submission. Rosemary became a ghost, a non-person, a sacrifice buried in the frozen ground of Wisconsin so that John F. Kennedy's path to the presidency could remain perfectly spotless, untainted by the reality of familial madness. This was how Joseph Kennedy exercised supreme, terrifying power within his own bloodline. He was a man who could order the physical mutilation of his daughter's brain with the same clinical detachment he used to short the stock market or structure a bootlegging route. To him, human beings were entirely transactional. If your utility dropped to zero, or if your presence threatened the central objective of his ambition, you were wiped from the sheet. With the threat of Rosemary successfully neutralized and locked away in the shadows, Kennedy turned his full, undivided attention back to the primary mission. The stage was finally clear. The money was clean. The sons were trained. The war hero mythology was locked in, and the dark blemish on the family genes had been surgically eradicated. Joseph Kennedy W., as ready to unleash his machine upon the American electorate, deploying the dark arts of the underworld and the immense power of his billions to pull off the ultimate heist, taking the keys to the White House by absolute force. But as he prepared to watch his son take the oath of office, he was entirely blind to the reality that history was quietly preparing its own ledger. The blood of the innocents he had trampled, the shattered mind of his daughter, and the violence he had subsidized in the shadows were gathering like a dark storm over his empire. The era of his absolute dominance was about to reach its glittering historic peak, but the terrifying bill for his ruthlessness was about to be hand-delivered to his doorstep. With the family's darkest secrets successfully neutralized and permanently locked away in a rural Wisconsin asylum, the path to absolute power was finally clear. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. no longer had to worry about a flawed daughter disrupting the immaculate aristocratic illusion he was selling to the American public. He turned his terrifying, undivided focus back to the primary objective. He possessed a massive, unassailable fortune, a network of highly compromised political allies, and a surviving son who had just returned from the Pacific as a decorated war hero. The patriarch was ready to deploy the full devastating weight of his empire to purchase the highest office in the land. The political rise of John Fitzgerald Kennedy is often remembered as a grassroots triumph of youth and idealism. But behind the soaring rhetoric of the new frontier stood the cold, calculating figure of Joe Sr., operating a political machine fueled by extortion, underworld alliances, and breathtaking cynicism. The immediate target was the United States House of Representatives in 1946. Jack Kennedy was thrust into the race for Massachusetts' 11th congressional district. Jack was an incredibly reluctant warrior. He was physically shattered, quietly suffering from severe Addison's disease and chronic agonizing back pain that often forced him to use crutches behind closed doors. He possessed the soul of a detached intellectual, not a backslapping politician. But Joe Sr. did not care about his son's physical agony or personal desires. Jack was simply the new vessel for the patriarch's unyielding ambition. Joe Sr. became the absolute, unquestioned dictator of the campaign. He micromanaged every detail, from the cut of Jack's suits to the cadence of his speeches. When Jack initially proved to be a stiff, awkward public speaker, Joe Sr. did not rely on natural political evolution. He relied on overwhelming financial force. He effectively bought the district. He saturated the neighborhoods with billboards, flooded the mailboxes with glossy literature funded by his Hollywood connections, and utilized his vast wealth to create the illusion of inevitable victory. But clean money was never enough for the patriarch. He instinctively reached for the dark arts of Boston ward politics. During the primary, Jack's most formidable opponent was a highly popular, deeply entrenched local politician named Joseph Russo. Russo had the crucial Italian-American voting bloc locked down, presenting a mathematical threat to the Kennedy campaign. Joe Sr. did not attempt to win over those voters through policy debates. Instead, he deployed a tactic of pure, cynical sabotage. The patriarch's operatives scoured the city until they found another man, a completely unknown blue-collar worker who possessed the exact same name, Joseph Russo. Kennedy's machine paid this man a substantial sum of money simply to file the paperwork and place his name on the primary ballot. It was a completely legal yet utterly anti-democratic maneuver designed solely to confuse the electorate. On Election Day, the Italian-American vote was fatally split between the real politician and the paid imposter. Jack Kennedy cruised to victory. The public saw a young war arrow ascending to power. The insider saw the brutal, uncompromising hand of the patriarch crushing the scales. But a seat in the House of Representatives was merely a stepping stone. The true psychological climax of Joseph Kennedy's domestic political revenge arrived 6 years later during the 1952 United States Senate race. This campaign was not just about political advancement. It was a deeply personal crusade. The incumbent senator from Massachusetts was Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. To Joseph Kennedy, Lodge was not merely a political opponent. He was the ultimate walking embodiment of the Boston Brahmin establishment. Lodge possessed the Mayflower ancestry, the patrician elegance, and the old money Protestant pedigree that had blackballed Joe Sr. from the Porcellian Club at Harvard 40 years earlier. Defeating Lodge was the patriarch's white whale. It was his chance to publicly, definitively humiliate the ruling class that had treated him like a second-class citizen. Joe Sr. approached the 1952 Senate race with a level of financial aggression that stunned the political establishment. He poured millions of dollars into the campaign, an unprecedented astronomical sum for a regional election at the time. He utilized a highly sophisticated modern public relations apparatus, essentially inventing the concept of selling a politician like a Hollywood movie star. But his most devastating strike was an act of raw financial extortion. In the final weeks of a razor-thin race, the endorsement of the Boston Post, a highly influential, traditionally Republican newspaper, was critical. The publisher of the Boston Post, John Fox, was planning to endorse Lodge, but Fox was secretly swimming in massive debt, and his newspaper was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Joe Sr. discovered this vulnerability and struck with surgical precision. He did not ask for an endorsement. He orchestrated a massive $500,000 loan directly to the publisher. It was a transaction completely devoid of ideology. The money was transferred, the financial bleeding stopped, and miraculously, just days before the election, the Republican Boston Post published a glowing front-page endorsement of the Democrat John F. Kennedy. Lodge was completely blindsided. Jack won the election, and Joe Sr. finally had the profound, vindicating pleasure of watching the Brahmin elite bow to his Irish Catholic son. By 1960, the ultimate prize was within reach. The campaign for the presidency of the United States was the masterpiece of Joseph Kennedy's dark architecture. Jack was the charismatic soaring front, a symbol of a new generation. But Joe Sr. was the ruthless engine operating in the shadows of the hotel suites, writing the checks, twisting the arms, and calling in every favor he had accumulated over a lifetime of corporate and political warfare. The fatal weakness of the patriarch, his absolute refusal to lose, regardless of the moral cost, drove him to cross a line that would permanently endanger his family. He realized that to win the presidency, he could not just rely on public relations and standard political bribery. He needed the deeply entrenched, highly corrupt labor unions, and he needed absolute control over the ward bosses in crucial swing states. To secure this, the former bootlegger reached back into the terrifying underworld he had utilized during the Prohibition era. Historical consensus, fueled by decades of FBI files and testimonies from political insiders, heavily suggests Joseph Kennedy brokered clandestine alliances with the highest levels of organized crime. He allegedly held secret meetings with Sam Giancana, the ruthless, bloodthirsty boss of the Chicago outfit. Kennedy and Giancana were men who understood each other perfectly. They both viewed the law as an illusion and power as the only reality. Kennedy needed Giancana's muscle to deliver two critical victories. The first was the West Virginia primary. Jack Kennedy needed to prove to the Democratic establishment that a Catholic candidate could win in a heavily Protestant, rural state. His opponent, Hubert Humphrey, was a principled politician running a campaign on a shoestring budget. Joe Sr. did not leave the outcome to chance. He flooded the impoverished state with briefcases full of untraceable cash. Operatives famously handed out money to local sheriffs, union leaders, and precinct captains, literally buying the primary vote by vote. Giancana's syndicate allegedly utilized their influence over the coal mining unions to guarantee the outcome. Humphrey was starved of resources and crushed by a machine he could not even see. The second and far more dangerous deployment of the underworld occurred during the 1960 general election against Richard Nixon. The race was agonizingly close, entirely dependent on the electoral votes of Illinois. Joe Sr. relied heavily on the notoriously corrupt political machine of Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley, which operated in a tight symbiotic relationship with Sam Giancana's mob. On election night, the ballot boxes in Chicago were held back, the numbers manipulated, and the dead miraculously rose from their graves to cast their votes for John F. Kennedy. The corruption was so blatant and the vote rigging so systematic that it left a permanent dark stain on the legitimacy of the 1960 election. But Joseph Kennedy did not care about the sanctity of the democratic process. He was buying the highest office in the land, and he was perfectly willing to use the exact same men who had once smuggled his illicit liquor to secure the final transaction. His relationship with Richard Nixon fully exposes this moral void. Kennedy possessed no genuine political ideology. He did not believe in the liberal values his son championed on the campaign trail. He treated the presidency exactly like a rigged horse race, hedging his bets to ensure he always held a winning ticket. In the years prior to the 1960 election, Joe Sr. had actually donated money to Richard Nixon's campaigns, and in a moment of chilling, cynical candor, he explicitly told Nixon that if Jack somehow failed to secure the Democratic nomination, the vast Kennedy fortune would immediately pivot to back Nixon for the presidency. It was a stunning admission that the patriarch viewed the leaders of the free world merely as interchangeable proxies for his own ego. When the sun rose on the morning after the 1960 election, the razor-thin victory was secured. The physical manifestation of Joseph Kennedy's triumph was absolute. He sat in his compound, surrounded by the flashing cameras of the global press, having achieved the impossible. The son of an East Boston saloon keeper, the man rejected by the Harvard elite, the disgraced former ambassador who had cowered during the London Blitz, had successfully engineered the takeover of the United States government. In January 1961, Joseph Kennedy Sr. sat wrapped in a heavy coat in the freezing cold of Washington, D.C., watching his son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, place his hand on the Bible and swear the presidential oath of office. It was the absolute glittering peak of his existence. He had forced the Brahmins, the political establishment, and the entire world to look up to his bloodline. He believed he had masterminded the perfect crime, stealing the crown without ever having to pay the price. But the universe has a terrifying, inescapable way of balancing its ledgers. Joseph Kennedy was completely unaware that the empire he had built with blood, betrayal, the shattered mind of his daughter, and the dark money of the underworld was about to violently collapse upon him. The power he had summoned from the shadows was about to demand a horrific, unimaginable blood sacrifice in return. And the great manipulator himself was about to be trapped inside a physical prison far worse and far more agonizing than anything his ruthless mind could have ever conceived. On December 19th, 1961. Louis assessed then a year after reaching the absolute summit of American political power, the universe delivered a terrifying, symmetrical judgment upon Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. He was playing golf in Palm Beach, Florida, reveling in his status as the invisible emperor of the United States, when he suddenly felt entirely unwell. He returned to his sprawling estate, retreated to his bedroom, and suffered a massive, catastrophic intracranial hemorrhage. His desperate need to dominate and control every human being in his orbit was instantly inverted. The stroke did not kill him. Death would have been a release. Instead, it trapped him in a physical purgatory perfectly designed for a tyrant. The severe brain damage left him paralyzed on his right side. But the most devastating blow was to his neurological speech centers. The man who had yelled his way into boardrooms, who had relentlessly interrogated his children at the dining table, and who had aggressively bullied the President of the United States, was struck with severe aphasia. He was rendered completely permanently mute. For the next 8 years, the patriarch of the Kennedy dynasty sat confined to a wheelchair. His mind remained agonizingly sharp, fully aware of his surroundings, completely capable of understanding complex political strategies, but he could not articulate a single word. When he tried to issue a command or express his rage, all that escaped his throat were guttural, meaningless syllables, often a frustrated, drawn-out repetition of the word no. He was forced to endure the ultimate humiliation for a master manipulator, absolute, inescapable impotence. He who had callously ordered a surgeon to carve out the brain of his daughter Rosemary, permanently silencing her to protect his political brand, was now permanently silenced by his own failing biology. This wheelchair became his prison as he was forced to watch the consequences of his unyielding ambition tear his family to shreds. The history books call it the Kennedy curse, framing it as a tragic, mystical run of terrible luck. But there was no mysticism involved. The violence that consumed the Kennedy family was the direct mathematical result of the toxic environment Joseph Sr. had built. He had demanded that his sons pursue power at any cost. He had funded their campaigns with underworld money, allied with dangerous men, and thrust his boys into the most volatile, high-stakes arenas on Earth, completely stripping them of any normal human caution. He had painted massive targets on their backs, and now he had to sit in silence while the bullets found their marks. On November the 22nd, 1963, Joseph Kennedy was sitting in his Hyannisport home when his surviving sons, Robert and Edward, walked into his room to deliver the news from Dallas. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the president he had bought and paid for, the son he had forced into the political arena to replace his dead older brother, had been assassinated in broad daylight. The physical reaction of the patriarch was harrowing to witness. The paralyzed titan simply stared at his remaining boys. He could not scream. He could not ask how it happened. He could not issue orders for retaliation. His jaw worked uselessly, and then he simply broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The great Wall Street operator, the man who had hedged every bet and managed every risk, suddenly realized that he could not buy his son back from the grave. The terrifying alliances he had forged, the enemies he had crushed on his way to the top, had created an atmosphere of political violence that finally breached the walls of Camelot. But the machine he had built possessed no off switch. Even from his wheelchair, the suffocating pressure of his expectations continued to drive his remaining sons forward. With Jack gone, the terrifying burden of the dynasty shifted instantly to the third son, Robert. Bobby Kennedy was the family enforcer, the son who possessed the most of his father's ruthless, calculating edge. He was pushed into the presidential race of 1968 not purely out of a desire to heal a fractured nation, but because the Kennedy brand demanded a restoration of the throne. Joseph Sr. watched Bobby's campaign on a television screen from his living room. He watched his son wade into massive, chaotic crowds, exposing himself to the exact same dangers that had killed his brother. And on June 6, 1968, history delivered its second agonizing strike. Robert Kennedy was gunned down in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. When they brought the news of Bobby's death to the patriarch, there was no dramatic outburst left in him. The nurses attending to him noted a profound, hollow despair settling over his paralyzed features. He had used the blood and tears of others to build his empire, and now he was drowning in his own. He had sacrificed his children on the altar of his own ego, and the altar was now demanding them all. Out of his 4 sons, 3 were violently dead. Yet the ultimate, most grotesque manifestation of Joseph Kennedy's moral decay, it did not occur on a national stage. It occurred on a small, dark bridge in Massachusetts, and it proved that the psychological rot he had injected into his bloodline was terminal. By the summer of 1969, Joseph Sr. was fading, his body shutting down. The entire weight of the Kennedy legacy now rested entirely on the shoulders of his youngest, most flawed son, Edward Ted Kennedy. Ted was a man who had been raised in an environment where accountability did not exist. He had been taught by his father that rules were for the lower classes, that women were disposable commodities, and that the family's wealth and power could erase any mistake. On the night of July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy drove his Oldsmobile off a narrow wooden bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. The car plunged into a dark tidal pond and flipped upside down. Ted managed to escape the submerged vehicle, but his passenger, a 28-year-old campaign strategist named Mary Jo Kopechne, remained trapped inside. What happened next is the perfect, horrifying distillation of the exact survival mechanism Joseph Kennedy Sr. had spent a lifetime teaching his sons. Ted Kennedy did not run to the nearest house to call the police. He did not call the Coast Guard. He did not launch a desperate rescue effort. Instead, he walked back to his hotel room. He went to sleep. The next morning, he woke up, ordered breakfast, and began making phone calls to his father's vast network of high-powered attorneys and public relations fixers to calculate how to save his political career. He waited a staggering 10 hours to report the accident to the authorities. By the time the police pulled the car from the water, Mary Jo Kopechne was dead. The diver who recovered her body testified that she had likely not drowned immediately, but had survived for hours in a pocket of air near the floorboards, suffocating slowly in the pitch black, waiting for a rescue that the scion of the Kennedy dynasty was too politically terrified to initiate. Chappaquiddick was the final undeniable proof of the patriarch's moral vacuum. Ted Kennedy had prioritized the preservation of the family's political brand over the life of a human being, exactly as his father had done to Rosemary nearly 3 decades earlier. The dynasty had survived, but its soul was completely, irreparably necrotic. Ted Kennedy would go on to serve in the Senate for decades, but the dream of a restored presidency was permanently dead in the murky waters of that pond. 4 months after Chappaquiddick, on November 18, 1969, Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. finally died at his home in Hyannisport at the age of 81. He died in the dark, trapped in a silent body, having lived just long enough to watch the magnificent multi-billion-dollar empire he had ruthlessly assembled be entirely washed away in blood, scandal, and profound national tragedy. The instinct is to simply label him a monster. It is easy to view his bootlegging, his extortion, his cowardly appeasement of fascists, and the mutilation of his daughter as the acts of a pure sociopath. But history demands a sharper, more objective lens. He was the product of a rigidly stratified society that told a wildly ambitious Irish Catholic man he would never be good enough. When the establishment locked the front doors of American power, Kennedy went into the shadows and smashed the foundation to pieces. He became exactly the kind of predator they forced him to be. His legacy is a staggering moral debt. It is a debt paid by the thousands of families he ruined on Wall Street, by the career of Alexander Pantages, by the shattered mind of Rosemary Kennedy, and ultimately by the violent premature deaths of his own sons. He treated the United States government as a hostile corporate acquisition, and he treated his children as the currency required to finalize the purchase. Yet this conditional verdict remains. If it weren't for his unyielding, terrifying drive, history might never have known the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Without Joe Sr.'s dirty money and underworld alliances, the soaring rhetoric of the new frontier, the handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the massive push for the Apollo space program might never have occurred. The father provided the dark subterranean roots that allowed the sun to briefly bloom in the sun. The tragedy of the Kennedys is not that they were uniquely cursed. It is that they were built by a man who believed he could buy the world, only to discover that the world eventually demands its change in blood.